Multiple choice exams. Just hearing the words gives most students a chill. Those suckers are so important to getting good grades, and yet they can be so tough. In this video, I'll be providing you with a behind the scenes look as to how professors make exams to hopefully give you a leg up when you're writing them. Hi, I'm Dr. Michael Holinsky. I'm a management professor at the Ted Rogers School of Management that has been able to achieve a 5-star rating on Rate My Prof. Every time I talk about Rate My Prof, I feel a bit like an Uber driver. Hey, come to my class, 5 stars. There are a series of Ace Your Exam videos currently on YouTube. They're made by a variety of students that share the general advice to pay attention throughout the entire course, start preparing in advance, and study extra hard the days leading up to a final exam. Now, while all those points might be valid in helping you succeed in your exams, the reality is most students cram for the exams the night before. So the general advice of preparing in advance and devoting endless amount of hours to every single exam is simply not feasible. But don't worry. In this video, I'll be sharing a blueprint for how professors make exams so that you have a blueprint for how to ace them, what questions to ask, and how to study in the most efficient manner possible. Specifically, I'll be talking about exam structure and test banks. And as a little added bonus, for those of you who stick around till the end, I'll be providing my top 5 favorite tricks that I use to fool students in multiple choice exams. The first step that professors take when they're making an exam is to make an exam structure. Okay? There are 2 key questions we ask ourselves when we're making an exam structure. 1, how many questions are going to be devoted to each type of question? So in other words, how many questions are going to be multiple choice, true, false, short answer, long answer, case studies? And second, how are we going to evaluate the textbook based on each type of question? So in other words, are you going to evaluate chapters 2, 3, 4 based on multiple choice and chapters 5, 6, 7 based on short answer? So why is this helpful? Well, knowing the number of multiple choice questions that will be on an exam will better allow you to allocate time when you're writing the exam. So now we're going to talk about test banks. Some students swear by studying from these test banks in order to succeed in multiple choice exams. So what are they? How do professors use them? And why do they matter to you? So what are test banks? They're a database of potential exam questions that professors may select when making your exam. They're strongly associated with textbook content as they're actually offered by the textbook publisher to professors. So how are they made? Textbook publishers outsource the creation of these test banks to current course instructors. These instructors are asked to follow specifics within the textbook when making the questions. They are also asked to make the questions based on a Bloom's typology, which ensures that the questions will vary in terms of difficulty as well as style. Now, professors vary in the extent that they use test banks. On one end of the spectrum, some professors love test banks. They copy test bank questions word for word and use them on their exam. Or they might modify a single word in the question so they feel that they'll fool students if students have seen the questions previously. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, some professors hate test banks. They feel that using a test bank is almost cheating when creating an exam, or they worry about exam integrity. Because, well, let's face it, these test banks will surface online and some students will be able to get their hands on them. If the students are able to get their hands on the test banks, then they'll have the answers to nearly every question available. So if those are 2 ends of the spectrum, most of us, to be fair, we're somewhere in the middle. We're inspired by these test bank questions, but we don't use them on a day-to-day basis, or we might significantly alter them to ensure that the questions better match how we're teaching the course. So on the one hand, if your professor does use test banks, then you're going to want to focus on 1, available test banks online, and 2, the specific details found in the textbook. In terms of test banks online, you should search for course codes, search for the textbook title, search for the professor's name, or even search for similar textbooks, other textbooks in the same field to find available test banks online. Because even if you find a test bank belonging to a similar textbook, it'll still give you a similar flavor or what you can expect on your particular exam. Now, I should acknowledge that there are legitimate and illegitimate test banks online. As a professor, I only promote the use of legitimate test banks. So on the flip side, if your professor does not use test banks, then you're going to want to focus your studies on big concepts. You're not going to want to get stuck in the weeds of remembering specific numbers. Focus on the big concepts. So the last piece of the puzzle related to test banks is to figure out whether your professor uses test banks or not. There's a couple tricks to look for when to figure this out yourself. The first is the slides. Professors that are more willing to use slides provided by the textbook publisher when teaching are also more likely to use those textbook quiz questions when creating their own exams. So look at the slides. Are the slides customizable, something that you would create yourself, or are they incredibly generic? Also, look at the color scheme. Did the color scheme of the textbook match with the color scheme of the slides? If yes, then you probably have a professor who's relying on the textbook slides to teach their class. And if so, they're probably relying on the textbook test bank to create their exams as well. The second thing you can do is to look for aspects from the professor, okay? Is this a contract instructor or is this a permanent instructor? Is this an instructor, have they taught this course for a long time, or is this their first time? For professors that haven't had enough time to fully invest in learning the material, teaching the material, and developing evaluation tools, probably are going to be leaning more on test banks when creating their exams. The third thing you can do is straight up ask the professor, hey, do you create your own questions or do you rely on test banks? Now you have to take this with a bit of a grain of salt because most professors probably wouldn't share truthfully whether they use test banks or not. So if you ask a professor, do you use a test bank, and they say yes, you probably have a good indication they do. But if you ask them and they say no, you might want to take that with a grain of salt because it is unclear. Okay, now we're going to be talking about my 5 favorite tricks that I use to fool students on multiple choice exams. The first is a definition question. For definition questions, you'll typically have a what is blank or what is the concept? And then you'll have a series of alternative options related to different definitions. Okay? So with option 1, one of the options, you're likely to have that correct definition. Another option will definitely be incorrect definitions, but similar style to what that correct definition is. One of the tricks here would be that you would also have a correct definition to another concept. You might be so focused on recognizing that one definition is correct that you might circle that one, even though the definition is actually to an alternative concept. Don't be fooled there. And another red herring you might have with that particular one is I might actually also have an incorrect definition related to that concept B, right? Or that other concept. So you might say, hey, this is the wrong definition for concept B. This is the right definition. And you might lose track of the fact that it's related to a completely other concept altogether. So to correctly address a definition question, the first thing you're going to want to do is look at the stem of the question. What is the concept? What is the word? Write out that definition on the side. Don't look at the options yet. And then once you write it out, figure out which option best aligns with the definition that you've written down on the paper yourself. Okay, the next trick question we're going to talk about is related to steps. So a step question might read, what are the appropriate steps in X concept, or what is the correct order of steps in a particular concept? So when it comes to this, you might have one option that includes a correct order, one option that includes an incorrect order, but then you might also have a series of options that vary in the extent to which their orders are incorrect. So you might have one option where the options are completely backwards from the correct process, or you might also have one option where just the process is entirely wrong altogether. One additional trick I'd like to add is I would include a correct process order, but for an alternative concept. So you might be so focused on identifying, hey, I know that this is a process that we learned in class, but if you can't link that correct process to the concept that we're asking in the particular question, you're likely to get this one wrong. So how to solve this? Once you read the stem of the question, you figure out the concept on the side of the paper, write down the process steps that you remember for that particular concept. Align what you've written down on the paper to the options in the exam, and you're going to nail it. The next trick question I want to talk about is the reverse question. A reverse question might read, which of the following is not an example of X? Or all of the following are examples of concept X except blank. So in this particular case, the words not and except are very, very important because they can actually reverse the meaning of a particular question. Many times when students are reading questions on an exam, they zero in on the major concepts that they've learned in the course. But when you focus on those concepts, you might miss the nuances of other words in those particular questions. And in this case, the words not and except might change the meaning of the question. And as a result, you might select an answer related to a concept rather than an answer related to the opposite of a particular concept. So anytime you see the word not or except, highlight those circles and read those questions very carefully. Okay, one of my favorite types of trick questions is what I call broad and precise. In this particular question, professors will zoom in from something that's a general concept to a very specific concept within the same multiple choice question. Let me give you an example. In this question, it reads, what factors are likely to affect employee engagement? And then there's a series of different options. Research suggests that job demands and job resources are highly related to employee engagement. And as a result, many students would probably select D, meaning A and B. However, option C, supportive supervisors, is a specific type of job resource. And as a result, the correct answer is actually E. Most students are thrown off because job resources are general and supportive supervisors are very specific. And that is why broad and precise is one of my favorite trick questions to include on an exam. Okay, my all-time favorite trick question is related to a word change. Now, it's probably my favorite just because there's so many different variations that you can use when you're applying this trick question in practice. So one of the first things you can do is you can include a typo in your alternatives or in your question. Okay, now is this an intentional typo or is this an unintentional typo? Students start to play games with this. Okay, so if I'm talking about leadership, but I don't want the word to be leadership, but I want it to make it sound like leadership, I might use an option leadship, which doesn't make any sense. Note, as a student, if there is a typo or you think that there's a typo, simply ask the professor, hey, was this intentional? Was this unintentional? And how does this impact how I'm supposed to correctly answer this question? Another option or another alternative to this idea is when I would swap a word from a meaningful concept. So if I'm talking about organizational culture, but I don't want that to be the correct answer, I might use the word individual culture, which doesn't have any meaning. Again, students might be locked on the idea of culture and may not recognize that the word individual in front of it negates the meaning entirely. Another deviation from this kind of idea with changing the words is related to identifying options that start with the same letter but have a very different meaning. So if I'm talking about culture and I want the answer to be culture, I might have different options that start with the letter C. So I might have cohort or other C words either for one option or all of the other options. Again, that might throw students off because there's a pattern that they see and they might see so many similarities between the words rather than focusing on the meaning associated with each word. So one of the ways to address this type of trick question, which is challenging, is to highlight the major concepts within the question. Are there any typos in those concepts? Are those concepts meaningful in the full extent, right? Rather than just culture, individual culture. Is there meaning behind each of these concepts? If not, raise your hand, ask the professor, hey, is this intentional? Was this supposed to make sense? And how does this change how I answer the question? All right, that's it for me. That's it for my discussion about how professors make exams. If you found this useful, hit the like button, hit the subscribe, and join me again next week as I provide students with additional resources they need to succeed in university.